My name's Mark Colvin. I'm the presenter of PM on ABC Radio. And with me, from my left to right, Stephen Loosley, who many will remember as an ALP senator, but from the point of view of this forum, he's the chairman of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, and more to the point, also a US politics and history buff, probably since university or even before. Geoff Garrett, who's the Dean of the Sydney University Business School, but until pretty recently was heading the US Studies Centre at Sydney University, and equally immersed in US politics. And from the US Studies Centre also at Sydney University, Tom Switzer, who others will know as the editor of the Australian version of The Spectator. And we were all here last year and put our reputations on the line. And so I think I probably should start with you, Tom. Pick up a microphone and give us your mea culpa.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Mark. I think that's right, and I think that Barack Obama and his Democratic supporters in America and abroad, and of course Barack Obama is overwhelmingly popular in Australia and virtually everywhere else in the world, they're entitled to gloat over those of us who doubted that the President would be re-elected or deserved to win. As you know, the national vote was fairly close, as most people predicted, but in America, the elections are determined by the Electoral College vote, and by all accounts it was the most impressive performance by the President to win more than 330 Electoral College votes. I don't think one should overstate the significance of this, because every President since Andrew Jackson in the 1830s who has been re-elected has won when the percentage of the national vote has increased. That hasn't taken place this time. This is the first time since Andrew Jackson. But nevertheless, you have to put this in context. Skyrocketing levels of debt, persistently high levels of unemployment, polls consistently showing that between 60 and 70% of the American people think their country is heading in the wrong direction. All the conditions, I think, were there for a one-term president, a la George H.W. Bush in 1992, Jimmy Carter in 1980, Herbert Hoover in 1932, at the time of the Great Depression. So in light of all of that, it was a most impressive performance. And as I say, I'm prepared to eat humble pie on the issue, and I was wrong. And I have to say that Stephen and Geoff, this time a year ago, were absolutely right in identifying some of the trends we'll talk about today.
Stephen, grab yourself a mic.
It's an extraordinary result when you consider the fact that the rate of unemployment in the United States, officially at 7.9, was high at the time of the general election. Only Franklin Roosevelt beating Governor Alf Landon from Kansas in 1936 has been re-elected with the rate of unemployment in the really high levels. It was 17 at the time, but people believed in 36 as they believed in 2012 that the United States was beginning to head in the right direction economically, and there was a poll that didn't attract much attention. It wasn't a poll of states or voters. It was a poll of Americans' view about their economic future, and this occurred just a couple of weeks before Election Day. And 42% of US citizens were saying they believed America was now going in the right direction, and that washed over into the polls. The Democrats performed extremely well on the ground and extremely well in cyberspace, as well as in the traditional areas of campaigning like television advertising. Spare a thought, ladies and gentlemen, for the citizens of the city of Las Vegas, Nevada, who between June the 1st and Election Day were exposed to approximately 75,000 television commercials, giving you some idea of the significance of Nevada to both sides. The deficit for the Republicans, Tom's right about the overall vote, of course, the deficit for the Republicans amongst different constituencies in a dramatically changing America. Demographic changes are quite astonishing. The Republicans were 80 points behind amongst African Americans, 50 points behind amongst Asian Americans, 40 points behind amongst Latinos, 40 points behind amongst American Jewish voters. That the gap is astonishing. Amongst American women, 18 to 29, the gap is 28% between Obama and Romney. Amongst American women overall, the gap is 11. So in order for the Republicans to come back seriously into consideration for 2016, there's got to be an extraordinary move by the Republican Party back into the centre ground and a ditching of a lot of the nonsense that's passed for policy. One example only, the Romney comment about self-deportation for illegals. I mean, just absolutely ruinous nonsense. A lot of that has to be ditched, and there is a great exchange at the end of the movie Game Change, taken from the book, which really occurred between John McCain and Sarah Palin, where McCain says to Palin, "Governor, don't let Rush Limbaugh hijack the party." Well, that's what happened, and the results can be seen now in the current state of play in American presidential politics, and in particular in the Senate, where the Tea Party endorsed people who simply could not win seats. And in a state like Indiana, where the Democrats really thought there was no chance of picking up an extra seat, the Senate seat was thrown away by the Republican candidate. So there's got to be a lot of change inside the Grand Ole Party between now and 2016, Mark.
Geoff Garrett, you take up from there.
What remains to be said, Mark, about, I guess we're going to start with a post-mortem on what happened in the election and then maybe pivot to what is on the docket today, literally today.
I think there's plenty to be said about the election, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So on the election, I'm just trying to go through in my mind things that Tom and Stephen haven't said. I guess I always thought that there were really two elections that could have happened in 2012. One was a referendum on the state of the US economy, and that was going to be a very hard one for Barack Obama to win. The other was going to be a referendum on Mitt Romney and the Republican Party, and that was going to be a very hard one for Romney to win. We sort of flip-flopped a little bit, like Mitt Romney, between those two elections. But at the end of the day, certainly on the demographics, it looks like the country was spooked by the Republican Party and by Mitt Romney. In particular, certainly for me, the biggest story is Latinos, socially conservative Latinos, who are now the largest minority grouping in the United States, voting, 70-30 Democrats. And for a black man, in an environment in which Latinos and African Americans historically have had pretty tense relationships politically, socially and otherwise, which also had a big, it's the US, so state by state matters. I think of the Mountain West in the US, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, maybe sometime soon even Texas, Arizona, as being Ronald Reagan cowboy states. Those were rock-solid Republican areas. Now, because of Latinos, Democrats can win those states. And if Democrats win those states, how does the Republican Party win the presidency? I don't know. They can certainly win, they can do well in Congress, maybe if they run good candidates, but the presidency looks tough. So what were really Americans voting for when they re-elected Barack Obama? I don't think this was like 1984 when Ronald Reagan was re-elected with a very high unemployment rate. That was morning in America. There was a lot of optimism in the country. I didn't feel that at all in this campaign, although I haven't been in the US for a couple of months. I don't know whether it's tipped, as Stephen might suggested. I just saw an enormously morose country. And it seemed to me that what Barack Obama at the end of the day was saying was, listen, now is not the time to gut the American welfare state the way those Europeans are doing. Austerity isn't working in Europe and we're not going to do it in the US. The good news for Obama, of course, was that when Mitt Romney selected Paul Ryan as his VP running mate, an aggressive attack on the US welfare state was something that middle Americans could start to fear as being a reality, because Paul Ryan was the ideological and intellectual spine of the Republican Party after the Tea Party won the congressional elections in 2010, and he was all about, quote unquote, privatizing Medicare, the most cherished part of the American welfare state. So I think it was a very negative, on all dimensions, a very negative and somber election. No euphoria in the US. But a view that, listen, now is not the time to do radical surgery to the way we run the country. And then I guess I'll just say implicitly underneath that, You know, Tom mentioned, and I think Stephen has already mentioned, spiralling debt as the biggest issue in the US. I don't think American leaders think that's true, and I don't think the American public thinks it's true. What they see is a country that can borrow money on international markets at 1.7%, negative real interest rates, with a public debt rate that actually is no higher than France or the UK, you know, be at the lower end of the EU spectrum, in an environment in which the US actually doesn't have to grow very quickly to get out of debt and deficit. So what I actually see was a vote for the status quo with an implicit presumption that the US doesn't have to do radical surgery on its welfare state, and what it's going to try to do in the next 3, 5, 10 years is, quote unquote, to grow its way out of debt and deficit, just as Bill Clinton did in the 1990s. And of course that means for me that the very next thing we'll see is a massive band-aid, not a big deal, to avert the fiscal cliff between now and the end of the year. But I am moving forward, Mark, sorry.
No, that's fine. If I may, I'll just put in sort of 5 cents of my own in terms of my own experience of this election compared to the last one. And I just want to talk for a minute or so about the web and the use of data and social media. And I think that Obama's campaign won very handily on all of those. But I watched the 2008 campaign, obviously, from here on the web. And then I watched this one on the web and much more on social media. I wasn't on Twitter last time, and Twitter was hardly a force last time. It was an enormous force this time. I think it's really worth noticing a few things like the 47% video, which was unearthed by a bunch of people and originally went out on a magazine called Mother Jones. A few years ago it would have probably stuck there for a week or two, but because of social media it went off like wildfire, and it was on the mainstream media within 12 to 24 hours. And that 47% video clearly had a considerably damaging effect on the Romney campaign. If you didn't see it, you don't know what I'm talking about. It was Romney speaking to an audience of extremely wealthy donors and telling them that there was a 47% of Americans who get welfare and depend on the state, and therefore were never likely to vote for him. So he was writing them off. There was a kind of contemptuous edge to it, and it hurt him a lot. Similarly, there were a lot of comments which might otherwise remain state-based by Republican senators and congressmen. I'm thinking particularly of senators who said that rape was God's will and that women shouldn't have abortions. And they immediately went national. Those things happen now. Every campaign has to deal with that. So Romney couldn't inoculate himself. He couldn't put up a barrier between himself and some of the congressmen and senators who were trying to get in on his coattails. The coattail effect worked the opposite way. And I think that the other point I wanted to make was that it's quite clear when you study the campaigns that Obama not only had a much better get-out-the-vote system, there were many more people, 50,000 people on the ground in Ohio, I think, getting out the vote, and lawyers there checking and against abuses and all the rest. And that seems to have been a much more effective campaign on the ground. That's in old-fashioned terms, but also probably what gave the Obama campaign the really big edge was the vast amount of data mining that it did, and so that it was able to target you or you or you with the things that their computers had worked out what issues you would be interested in. And so they were making robocalls or putting things through letterboxes or actually approaching people to talk to them about the issues that they wanted. It's getting more and more refined, this stuff. And again, it's stuff that no campaign can ignore anymore. So that's
just a point on the observation you made about the Mother Jones vision from Romney's speech in Boca Raton, Florida. I thought it actually taught us something about Romney to the extent that he wasn't really a politician. in essence. And Romney was the best of the Republican field. It was the most undistinguished field otherwise. And Barack Obama, of course, was unopposed for the Democratic nomination. That's important to an incumbent president. But Romney talking about 47% of the American people regard themselves as victims, they have their hands out and so on, and I'm not really interested in them, ignored the fact that important constituencies among those 47% of Americans included rock-solid Republican core constituencies, such as military retirees.
Yeah, lots of retirees.
And in the 53%, in the 53% where Romney's supposedly campaigning, are a lot of people like me who've done very well out of the system, but in essence are yellow dog Democrats. You know, that's a Texas Democrat who votes the ticket even when it's led by a yellow dog. Given the history of the Texas Democratic Party, that can never be ruled out either. But circumstances being what they were, he didn't understand the electorate which he was contesting. An excellent CEO, had a good record as governor of Massachusetts, but as a presidential candidate, he just didn't understand.
Yeah, and I think in fairness to the Democrats, they ran a very good ground campaign. You know, there were 800 field offices for the Democrats across the United States. There were 300 Republican. That's extraordinary when you consider that the Romney campaign spent $1 billion in fundraising, whereas I think they just outstripped the Obama campaign, 9.3 million. So they ran a very good ground campaign, and they particularly ran very good negative attack ads against Romney, not just through the last 2 months of the campaign, but throughout much of the year, especially after the primaries were established that Mitt Romney would be the nominee. In the northern summer, barrage of negative attack ads that Mr. Romney was a Mr. Monopoly man without the top hat and cane, a sort of Gordon Gekko vulture capitalist who lacked empathy and authenticity. And it really worked very well there. It solidified this image of Romney as being out of touch with middle America at a time
he did
of
make it
widespread
easier
dissatisfaction.
for them.
And of course, that's right. Romney himself was bedeviled by a series of missteps and gaffes. Absolutely.
Did not help him in
Indeed.
that.
But mind you, having said all of that, after the first presidential debate, Romney did redeem himself somewhat. That changed the nature of the campaign, albeit briefly. But he did give the impression of being very reasonable and a pragmatic guy, and he clearly outclassed the president in that first presidential debate. So that gave the impression that he wasn't so bad after all, but of course, as we now know, it ultimately didn't affect those important battleground states.
Jeff, why do you think that so many of the media, not just the right-wing media, but particularly the right-wing media, got it so wrong?
Well, of course, this is where this is a very rare occasion when the geeky political scientists look pretty good, right? So let's talk about two things: gut feel and where the money trail was going. In the US, you can't. In Australia, you can gamble on anything. In the US, it's harder to gamble on things, but you can gamble on politics. There's a site called InTrade, as you know. And I don't think Obama was ever below about 65-35 on InTrade. So insiders thought Obama was going to win all along. It was 65-75. Why would you get it wrong if you were in the mainstream media? Because you're staring at the fact that the country, not only with the unemployment rate that we've talked about, and the externalities from unemployment. Remember that the unemployment rate was going down not because more people were being employed, but because fewer people were looking for jobs. They were so depressed that they weren't even looking for jobs anymore. In addition to that, the scary statistics still in the US, although this might have turned around, is the 230%. Housing prices are down 30% since 2006 and haven't really come back. But 30% of Americans owe more on their homes than their homes are worth, and you're in a consumer debt-driven country that's deleveraging like crazy. And as I said, I just got the sense, certainly when I visited the US in the past 12 months, the country is just morose. Americans are inherently, inveterately optimistic people, and that is not what you get in the country. And I think that's why externally we think it even more, because of course you'd expect Americans to be naively, wildly optimistic about prospects in their country, and you just don't feel that at the moment. This is extraordinary. The depth of the downturn and the length of the downturn. And of course the other thing, the US tends to think, boy, we're the author of our own destiny, we can change everything. people are staring at Europe and China and saying, oh my God, you know, the other two parts of the global economy, we don't know what's going to happen there, and it's likely to be negative as well. So you put all that negativity together, and, you know, it wasn't Jimmy Carter in 1980, but the same, I think Republicans all along were hoping that it was like 1980, and all they needed was a good Iran crisis, and that would have tipped Barack Obama over. So that's the disconnect.
They kept on Twitter, you know, Dick Morris and people kept on saying there'll be an October surprise, believe me.
Well, and you know, and if you think about you think about that, I mean, Obama, what did Obama do well to avert the kind of crises that could have tipped him over? Well, one was a gutsy call, which was not using drone strikes to go after Osama bin Laden, but going in the door with a helicopter in an environment in which we have very bad helicopter memories of Iran in 1980, and even worse, Black Hawk Down for Bill Clinton in 1993. So I think that was a gutsy call for Obama for the world, but of course getting it right on Osama meant that foreign policy was never going to be an issue because his backbone was clear. He had a one-sentence response to any question about his foreign policy mettle. But the second one that happened earlier this year that is clearly going to be repeated, but when I was in Washington, I think in both January and February, it was a massive issue, was trying to convince Benjamin Netanyahu that the US in Barack Obama was still Israel's friend enough that the Israelis didn't do a unilateral strike against Iran, and that was the big worry. If you know, all bets are off for everything, I think, in the world if the Israelis decide that they need to do a unilateral strike in Iran, and Barack Obama kept trying to walk the Israelis off that cliff, and the way he did it, I think, was to be a bit tougher on Iran. So, not 1980, but I think that, you know, Tom used to talk about high gas prices. I remember when Tom was salivating about all this. There were high gas prices, crises in the Middle East, high unemployment. By God, Barack Obama is Jimmy Carter. It just didn't quite get there.
Stephen?
You salivate about some odd things, Tom.
I mean, it's a great year to get excited about.
The Republicans were running a campaign for Ronald Reagan in 1980, and they had simply missed the fact overwhelmingly that America has changed so dramatically. The last 20 years, the proportion of white Americans in the constituencies down from 80 plus to just over 70 plus. In another decade, it'll be in the 60s, and you had dramatic growth amongst newer constituencies. In Washington in July, senior Democrats would say quietly to you, now of course our unofficial campaign slogan is General Motors is alive and Osama bin Laden is dead. This, of course, courtesy of the Vice President's speech in Charlotte, became the open campaign slogan. Very effective. The Democratic campaign did not work on the basis of simply defending the record, but looking to the future and saying this is two alternative visions for the United States. Here we have Governor Romney's vision, and Tom's quite right. Immediately after the primaries, the Democratic campaign painted Governor Romney in such stark colours that a great many Americans walked away from the thought of voting Republican. And here is the Obama vision for the future, much more reassuring. And then you have the October surprise a few days before the election, turns out to be Hurricane Sandy. And FEMA responds effectively. The President is there in command, and then you have Governor Chris Christie, one of the presidential critics, come out and frankly endorse the President a few days before the poll.
And again, social media came into that because they immediately dug out the quote from during the debates during the primaries where Mitt Romney said that he wanted to abolish FEMA.
FEMA should go back to the states, and of course for most Americans the immediate contrast was with President George W. Bush and Katrina in New Orleans. So all of these things are working. I think Jeff's absolutely right on Iran. It may be now that the pressures on the Iranians, including the pressures on their currency, are such that they come to the negotiating table with a re-elected Obama administration. So I'd say that was a good call, as the Bin Laden and al-Awlaki calls were good, tough calls at the time. But there's no question that the Republicans missed the changes in America that are taking place demographically and are really dramatic. And the election became a referendum on two competing visions for the future of the country. And if you're looking for a parallel between Australia and the United States, given the differences in the systems and the differences in issues, that probably is the one that stands out.
Now, I'll just say something again myself. The other thing that comes into all that, because Geoff was saying that this is maybe one of the rare occasions when the computer geeks, the stats geeks, win out. I don't think it is. I think it's going to be increasingly, that's increasingly going to be the pattern. All this centred around a guy called Nate Silver, who runs a website called 538.com. In the 2008 election, which I followed partly via his site, he not only got the presidential result right, but all the Senate seats but one. He has a series of algorithms, and he runs the possibilities again and again and again through his computers, and then he comes up with probabilities. By this time, he had moved to the New York Times. It's still the same site, but he's got a blog on the New York Times, which automatically made him part of the East Coast establishment and turned him into a target. He became a target, sometimes in extremely personal terms. People saying that he was making it up, that everything that he was doing was kind of skewed because he was a Democrat supporter. But actually what happened was, I don't know if anyone here has seen the film Moneyball, rather good film, I thought, but it's about a baseball team which takes on a computer geek, a statistician, running very similar types. Yeah, no, but the geek looks like a geek. And
the geek.
Yeah. Brad Pitt is the manager, and he puts his faith in the geek.
That's right.
And then they have this series of attacks from all the traditionalists, all the people who've always said, baseball it's about feel, it's about the gut, do it the old way. And they have a bit of a difficult beginning of the season, and then everything falls into place, and they have one of the greatest seasons in the whole of professional baseball. And that's how it ended up, because Nate Silver once again got it dead right as anybody has ever got it. And I rather think that we should all be thinking about that we've all, journalists, pundits, whatever we are, we have all flown on the seat of our pants and had different results over the years. I've been covering elections of various sorts for nearly 40 years now, but I think we have to yield some ground to the statisticians.
Absolutely, and I think Mark is right. Nate Silver does emerge from this election with his credibility and prestige enhanced, absolutely. But to your original question, why Republican pundits and partisans and conservative pundits got this wrong, I think there was a sense that the 2008 election was a bit of an aberration, that the turnout among a lot of these minority groups, particularly Hispanics and African Americans and younger women, single women, that was a one-off. And that all the pollsters in the lead up to 2012 were taking into account that these folks would turn out on election day. And so folks like Karl Rove, Dick Morris, these are fellows who've been senior advisors to presidents and helped get those presidents re-elected. They argued, or they assumed, that the black vote, the Hispanic vote, and a lot of young women, single women, would not turn out to vote. And we were wrong for that reason. So the statisticians completely got it right.
Another reason, just to interpolate there, Karl Rove was also the president of a PAC, Political Action Committee, which had pumped $300 million into the Republican campaign. That amount of money is liable to skew your judgment.
That's right. Good point. Yeah, and that's right. And I think on that note, there was a famous quote after the 1972 landslide election victory, Richard Nixon over George McGovern. And Nixon won every state but one, Massachusetts, when he beat George McGovern in 1972. And Pauline Kael from The New Yorker, she was the art critic, I think she's now dead, film critic, well-known liberal, American liberal. She said the next day, "How could this possibly be? There's no one I know who voted for Richard Nixon." Well, I think that the Republican Party in this election had a bit of Pauline Kaelism about them. If you watch shows like Fox News Channel and read the Wall Street Journal editorial pages, I do, you end up being in a bit of an echo chamber. And I think that was something that Republicans were very guilty of in 2012, just like a lot of Democrats were in 1972.
Funny little mirror image there, because there's a mayor of a local town in Massachusetts who went viral the other day by saying there were a lot of black people voted in our polling booths, and they must have been blow-ins, they must have been frauds, because I don't know any black people.
Yes, you said that on the record.
Yeah, on the record. So let's kick on, Stephen. Do you want to sum up where we've got to from here first?
I think it's been a pretty fair post-mortem on the presidential election. There's one moment I particularly enjoyed, because I'm addicted to parts of Fox News. I like to get into the minds of my political alternatives. The Jon Stewart show, with which many people would be familiar, showed MSNBC, Rachel Maddow and Chris Matthews just excoriating the president for the loss of the debate in Denver. And Tom mentioned that earlier. Fair enough. So the left gives away the first debate, gives it to Mitt Romney. Fair result. Stewart then cut to Fox News on the vice presidential debate, which most people gave to Vice President Biden. And you can live in an alternative universe until you actually get mugged by the reality, and the reality is the voters. So how did Fox News describe the vice presidential debate? They produced a doctor who said, "I detected the early onset of dementia." Another woman comes on and asks the rhetorical question, "Had Biden been drinking?" So Jon Stewart said, "So there's the summary, folks. An angry, demented, drunken old man wiped the floor with our guy." Marvellous moment. The Republicans have their challenges, Mark, as we've discussed. Expect to see the hardheads begin to reassert themselves in the party, particularly hardheads of Latino background and electoral success. I'm thinking of Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, a new senator off on the right but very effective Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, and Senator Martinez from New Mexico from memory. I think that these are people who will bring the Republicans back into play if they have their way, and expect to see the people that we've seen dominating the airwaves, Newt Gingrich's, Sarah Palin's and so on, fade somewhat. For the Democrats, of course, the challenges are in government, in dealing with the issues that are on the agenda now. We've already seen some movement on immigration, courtesy of Senator Chuck Schumer, who's a Democrat from New York, and Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, starting to move into the centre. I suspect that the real negotiations on taxes and debt and deficit are occurring between Senators Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell, who've been able to hammer out compromises previously, and if the White House endorses this, then the House Republicans, with some complaints, will eventually go along. Everyone's already starting to look to 2016, and I think perhaps towards the end we might talk a little bit about that. There are challenges for both sides, and the period of the lame duck Congress over the next few weeks to avoid the fiscal cliff is really going to be fascinating. Leon Panetta, the Defence Secretary, has made it very clear to the Congress, courtesy of a briefing from the Vice Chiefs of the US Armed Services, that the fiscal cliff is an absolute catastrophe for American national security in terms of the cuts to Pentagon and to deployments and so on and so forth. So I suspect a deal will be hammered out, and that deal is probably centred in the American Senate right now, rather than in the dealings between the House and the White House.
Jeff, let's just go back to the Republicans and their recovery. Do you agree with Stephen that the hardheads will be able to take control? Well,
Stephen's hardheads were Latinos, which is very interesting, because that's not what we think of as the Republican establishment. The Jon Stewart, who got a lot of things right in this election campaign, called the Republican convention, I think, the road to Jeb Bush 2016. And I don't think that's not a bad guess. You know, Jeb Bush is a smart guy who speaks Spanish and can win Florida. We're not going to go to 2016, but I think it could well be a dynastic election, 2016. Republicans were...
Yeah, well, David Frum, who is a Republican, certainly in name, although he's been rather shunned by them, ostracised, chucked out of the American Enterprise Institute and so forth, but basically for being an old-line Republican. He talked about the conservative entertainment complex, basically blamed Fox for a lot of this. I wonder if you think that if Fox stays the same, which seems likely under Roger Ailes and Rupert Murdoch, that it's going to be possible to wrench the Republicans out of the grip of the Tea Party.
Well, the Republicans in Congress obviously are pretty divided at the moment, and Stephen was talking, I think, appropriately about the Senate, but in the House of Representatives we've got this weird situation where John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, is considered a sort of flaming lefty by a lot. A long time ago, Boehner was considered a very conservative guy, but the Republican Party has moved so far to the right that he now looks like a flaming lefty. Under attack, he would have been under attack from Paul Ryan. Who knows whether that will continue. Cantor, the head of the Finance Committee in the House, is clearly going to attack him. The party's divided, and I guess the reason the markets were spooked immediately after the election was they thought that, yes, there's going to be some soul-searching in the Republican Party, but this literally might tear them apart so badly that they won't be able to act in their own interest to avoid the fiscal cliff.
But Stephen's right, and all this revolves around the fiscal cliff.
Well, it does, and I think the Democrats have got, in the debt ceiling debate in whenever it was, August last year, the Republicans held all the aces. This time I think the Democrats hold all the aces because you've really got Republicans who now have to vote to cut the Defense Department and vote to get rid of a whole bunch of tax cuts. And can you really be a Republican and do that? So what I think that means on the fiscal cliff is that we've pivoted in two ways. First, there's the issue of the Bush tax cuts for people who earn over $250,000, and Obama has restated that now in very Australian terms. It's not that you earn more than $250, it's your income above $250, so you get the tax cuts below. But I think that there's a path of least resistance there that's all about small business, because the Republicans say that millionaires aren't millionaires, they're small business owners and we need to create jobs. So I bet there's going to be some language in the tax cut extensions that'll talk about small business. Of course, I'm sure Mitt Romney is a small business owner, because if you invest your own money and you got somebody, I don't know, cleans your house, manages your money, does anything else, you're a small business owner. So I'd expect that one. And then what they're going to do on spending, again, depends on how you look at it, is either kicking the can down the road or it's pretty sensible, which is they're going to push off into the future the big spending cuts and make sure that that you don't take 2+% out of the US economy right now, because that's going to tip the country and the world into recession. So I'm reasonably optimistic. I don't know whether I saw the senators overnight are talking about an early resolution rather than pushing this out towards Christmas. I don't see how they can solve this stuff really quickly, so we'll have some agonising. But there's reason for optimism at the moment, I think.
Tom, tackle those two questions: the Republicans, their future, and the fiscal cliff. They're linked.
Yeah. Well, one of the intriguing issues that has emerged out of this election, I think, Mark, is to what extent does the United States remain a centre-right nation? The overwhelming consensus since the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s is that the centre of political gravity has moved to the right, and certainly within the Republican Party to the hard right when it comes to a lot of these economic issues. But 10 years ago, my friend and colleague John Judas wrote a book called The Coming Democratic, or The Emerging Democratic Majority. And his argument was that as the minority vote increases and the white share of the national vote continues to decline, this portends real problems for the Republican Party that overwhelmingly represents middle-aged and older white folks. And that slowly but surely this will mean the landscape will become more liberal and progressive. And indeed, in 2008, candidate Obama, when he was running against Hillary Clinton in the primaries, campaigned on the platform that he would be a transformational president, meaning that he, like Ronald Reagan, not Nixon, not Clinton, but like Ronald Reagan, would preside over ideological realignment of the United States. And just as Reagan made America a more conservative place, he, Obama, would make America a more liberal place. And if you just look at some key issues like gay marriage, it's fascinating. This really puts a lot of conservatives on the back foot here. In 2008, Barack Obama ran to the right of Dick Cheney on the question of same-sex marriage. In 1996, President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. In 2004, Gallup said that 60% of the American people opposed same-sex marriage, 30% supported it. Today, in 2012, that's 8 years later, polls show 55% of the American people support same-sex marriage and less than 40% oppose it. Now that is a striking sea change on a red-hot button culture war issue in just a short period of time. And indeed on the election campaign, this issue hasn't been getting much attention in Australia. 4 states on the very day of the election had a referendum on whether same-sex marriage should be legalised, more or less. And they all supported it. And I think this was the first time in something like 32 referenda on the question, when it's been taken to the people, where the people have supported gay marriage. So this is just an example of why I think the political landscape is actually becoming more liberal, and Obama is in a prime position, and the Democrats are, and it pains me to say this, given that I'm more conservative, obviously, on a lot of these issues, but nevertheless, there is a sea change taking place in America. And what that means for the fiscal cliff, well, I think ultimately Geoff is right about there being some kind of compromise, and there'll be a deal on the renewal of the Bush-era tax reductions, not across the board, but for all those earning $250,000 or less, but they'll muddy the language on the $250,000 question for small business and whatnot. And both parties will have to come to some sort of consensus also on the other fiscal cliff, which of course is the spending cuts, the $1.3 billion in spending cuts, $1 trillion in spending cuts that will take place over the next decade, and that's largely in the defence industry.
I think just to pick a little detail on what you said, what's interesting about the demographic changes is that it's slowly isolating older and middle-aged whites and more males than females too. It seems to me that I think the projection is that by 2050 whites will be outnumbered in the United States, but I think that the 20s and 30s and up to the 40s are increasingly unworried about that. There's a much more multicultural sense.
Well, and the other thing that you've got to remember, we think about states in the US all the time because the Electoral College is by states. But the real thing, if you look at the county by county, is that Democrats win every city and every college town in the United States, and they don't win anywhere else. And the flip is true for the Republicans. You get outside an urban area or a university town, and Republicans are dominant. And that's true even in places like Texas. You look at the Texas map, and the Democrats are winning the big cities, and they win Austin really easily, where the University of Texas is. So I think this story about demographic change also has this urbanness to it that that I think again 10 years ago people were going the other way. They're saying that Americans are leaving the city, and that's because they're conservative, right? They're buying better schools and better houses and bigger houses by getting the hell out. That doesn't seem to be the story today. It's probably like the rest of the world. This sort of when you live in an urban environment, you're just much more comfortable with difference.
Also, as with Australia, automation has meant there's far fewer farmers and far fewer farm workers, and that's driving people into the cities too.
Yeah, and there are some states like places like Iowa, where now the Iowa government is paying young people lots and lots of money to stay in the state because they know that the young people just want to get the hell out.
The demographic changes that have taken place in the last generation in the United States did not inevitably have to favour the Democratic Party. The Republican Party made a massive contribution consistently and continuously in driving Latinos into the Democratic Party's embrace, beginning out in California nearly a generation ago, where, from memory, Pete Wilson was governor at the time. essentially services in health and education denied to illegal immigrants. And roll it forward, you had people like a congressman out in Colorado named Tancredo, who was forever belting the immigration drum. You've had what's happened in Arizona, which the Obama administration opposed in terms of the police having quite extraordinary powers to stop and search people they suspected of being aliens. I mentioned earlier the self-deportation nonsense. Latino voters should be a natural Republican constituency, overwhelmingly family-oriented, religious in their observations, often in small business. But this community overwhelmingly has been conceded to the Democrats, and that brings me to the point. In 2016, Texas will be contestable. Yep. So you have a circumstance in which the Democrats carried California, New York, and Florida. Without Texas and Florida, the Republican Party is not in the hunt to win the presidency of the
bear in mind, a lot of
United States.
Hispanics did vote for President Bush and Governor
yes,
Perry.
And the Bush family sat this election out. There was there was a photograph of President George H.W. Bush meeting President Obama, chatting away in one of the White House sitting rooms with Governor Jeb Bush of Florida. No comment. It was a clear, nuanced signal from the Bush family they were sitting the election out. And I think for 2016, Jeb Bush is a much more formidable candidate in the middle ground than anyone we've seen produced by the Republican Party of recent times.
Let's take some questions, and because we've been foreshadowing that we'll get to 2016, has anyone want to start with a question about 2016? Hands? Anyone? Anyone got a question at all? Yeah, question over here. Oh, back there.
Sorry. You you've missed the point in this discussion. Haven't focused on the dollars. It's the white older people who have the largest savings in the US. So I'd be interested to see as this liberal environment evolves, as you've indicated, what part that resource of savings of the white older people will have.
Who wants to take that?
Let me respond on this point. There's about $3 trillion locked up in American corporate treasuries at the moment. An end to the gridlock, even a substantial easing, a significant easing of the gridlock in Washington DC, I suspect unlocks a great deal of that for investment. Lifts the US economy and lifts the economy globally in Europe and in our part of the world. If you're looking at where dollars went during the campaign, the Obama campaign more than matched the official Romney campaign, but the dollars came, again as in 2008, overwhelmingly from small contributions. Enormous numbers of small contributions, $10, $20 and so on. I expected that as a result of the Supreme Court's decision in 2010 on Citizens United, that the PACs, the political action committees which were oriented towards the Republicans, would swamp some of the Democratic campaigns. It really didn't happen. And part of that was the Democrats' capacity, through social media in part, to raise considerable sums of campaign dollars from small contributions. But I think the key point about those dollars being locked up at the moment are those to be found in American corporate treasuries that really are dependent upon an end to the uncertainty in Washington DC.
And can I just add in one sentence?
A lot moves.
American firms have figured out in the global financial crisis they can make more money employing fewer Americans. And it's really unclear to me that that's going to change. And that's a massive social challenge to the US because it doesn't have a welfare state that can deal with that. You know, they're making more money now with more automation and more money offshore, and I don't see that that's going to change anytime soon.
Tom? I'd just add one thing, which is that I think there's an interesting lesson out of this election about money, and that is that some of the really biggest donors, Sheldon Adelson and the Koch brothers, put a huge amount of money into campaigns backing a lot of candidates who lost, and the this harks back to what Stephen just said. People who thought that Citizens United was going to drastically distort elections for years to come got a strange surprise. I mean, money is obviously very important, but not necessarily the way they thought.
You've made a lot about the changes in demography in America over the last couple of years, and a lot about the minorities particularly favouring the Democrats, and some of those minorities, as you've made the point, are not as minor as they used to be. What's the influence, though, of the lack of compulsory voting in America? And do the geeks that you've also been talking about show us whether or not the election result would have changed had we actually had compulsory voting?
Tom, you start there.
Well, I suspect that if there were compulsory voting, it would help the Democrats. I think that's well regarded, although it's not altogether clear how voluntary voting would affect Australia, for example. So it might be the other way. It might help the Liberals. But I don't know of any substantial academic scholarship on this question. The fact is there is no push for compulsory voting. Now, on the issue of minorities, that's exactly the point that John Judas made 10 years ago, that as the minority vote increases and the white share of the national vote declines, this will merely change the balance of power. But of course, there's always a danger here in assuming that certain ethnic groups will vote as a monolith, or close to being a monolith. Stephen, on this point about Hispanic Americans, this wasn't always the case for the Republican Party. Ronald Reagan was a big champion of immigration. George W. Bush, his brother Jeb, big champions of immigration. Rick Perry, the controversial Texas governor who ran against Mitt Romney in the primaries, shot himself in the foot when he said, if you oppose the amnesty for illegal immigrants, you lack a heart. And that destroyed him. And Romney made a big miscalculation by running to the right of Rick Perry on this question, and that came back to haunt him. So I think that these demographic changes, while they're evident, it doesn't necessarily mean that these groups will overwhelmingly vote Democratic. But I do concede the Republican Party needs to start changing its tone and emphasis, especially on the question of immigration from south of the border.
The great impact of voluntary voting is that the parties concentrate overwhelmingly on mobilising the vote for election day, which our parties don't have to worry about. That's why the campaigns tend to be so very negative, because you're demonising your opponent to suppress his or her vote while endeavouring to motivate your people to come and vote.
Another question? Back there.
Some comments Jeff made earlier about this general mood of moroseness and a lack of optimism in the United States. And I read a statistic that about 8 to 10 million people who had voted for Barack Obama in 2008 didn't go out and vote for Barack Obama this time. And the comment earlier about people that don't go to vote at all, about 95 to 100 million people who are eligible to vote in the United States don't go to vote. I wonder whether this lack of confidence you talk about is reflective of a general feeling in the United States, with broad layers of the population, that the American political system as a whole, both parties, are unable to resolve effectively, or in a way in which people have some confidence in is going to resolve these massive problems that the United States faces historically.
It's a great question. I made this point this time a year ago. A nation whose hallmark, and this is one of Jeff's earlier points, its hallmark is an irrepressible sense of optimism and purpose. It's bitterly divided and very uncertain. Gallup, earlier this year, Gallup opinion polling, which is probably the most authoritative opinion polling, 81% of the American people are dissatisfied with the nation as it is governed. Now, that's a reflection on not just the executive, but also the legislature, the White House as well as the Congress. Only 24% of the American people believe their country was heading in the right direction. It's an historic low. And I think what's happened here is that American exceptionalism, you know, this idea, this belief that America is born of an idea, dedicated to a proposition, claiming a manifest destiny, I think in many respects history has left American exceptionalism behind, and it's become increasingly evident over the last decade. The persistently high unemployment. But people forget the recession ended in June of 2009. It's been more than 3 years, and you've still got persistently high unemployment, skyrocketing levels of debt, alarming trade and budget deficits, crumbling infrastructure, a demoralised psyche, a dysfunctional and some say polarising political system that's beholden to special interests. I mean, I'm feeling like that episode in Fawlty Towers. You know, when the hotel inspector goes up to Mr. Fawlty and says, "Mr. Fawlty, this hotel's a mess. You know, you've got the fridge isn't working, the ovens are dirty, you've got 2 dead pigeons in the water tank, blah, 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 blah." And Basil Fawlty replies, "Otherwise okay?" Well, it's not otherwise okay, and this is the point. American exceptionalism has taken a big hit.
You just can't listen to this stuff. Here's what you should be betting on. Bet on 3+% growth out of the US economy in the next decade, because it's still the world's innovation engine and it's the world's immigration magnet. Yes, the US has got some problems, but take a look at the US versus any other Western country absent Canada and Australia, and the US looks better. That's in macroeconomics. The problem in the US, I think, is that the social compact is potentially broken. And I'm going to have to put my mic down here because I'll try to do it with 2 hands. Bill Clinton is a hero for many people. In the 1990s in the US, inequality went through the roof. But here's the problem. In the 1990s, this was the top of the US and this was the bottom of the US. My hand is crooked, but average Americans were doing better. Here's the 2000s. Yes, there was massive inequality in the US, but average Americans were doing worse. Median per capita income went down in real terms 10% in the 2000s, in an environment in which the US doesn't have a welfare system to deal with those people's problems. So I think partisan gridlock in Washington is a bit epiphenomenal. It's a result of this massive division in society, in which the top of the US system is going absolute gangbusters and will continue to do so, and so the Dow will be strong and growth will be strong. The problem is that average Americans don't believe that they've got a future, and that's a pretty scary social problem.
Stephen?
I'm a little more optimistic than my colleagues for a couple of reasons I'll come to in a moment. Firstly, on people who don't turn out to vote, I was always heartened by Gore Vidal's observation that he noted that 50% of Americans no longer read a daily newspaper. He hoped they were the same 50% who didn't go out to vote. Secondly, something happened out in California, and there were some other propositions that were carried in different parts of the US that give me great heart. There's a proposition in California called Proposition 30, which was backed by Governor Jerry Brown. It's designed to plug a hole in the Californian budget, raises about $6.5 billion, and for money to be spent on schools. And again, state income tax increases on the wealthiest Californians. That went through. And it may well be that this obsession with cutting taxes everywhere, despite the fact of what the money is needed for in infrastructure, that may well be receding. And that dreadful problem that Galbraith identified a long time ago of private affluence and public squalor may be coming back into focus in a more positive sense. I finish on this note. Most of the indicators now suggest that the United States will be energy self-sufficient by the end of this decade, because of a variety of things the administration's doing, things that are happening in terms of exploration, gas and the like. That is going to have a profound change for the US and a profound change for the globe, and much of that will be positive.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've got to finish. Our hour is up. Despite the gentleman at the back who said that we'd all completely missed the point, I think that we've actually, I think we've hit a number of points, and I don't think you would find a better brains trust on US politics just about anywhere in the world. And no, I certainly don't think you'd get a better and more civil conversation. We all have different views in different ways, but it's possible for us all to sit on this podium and enjoy each other's company, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. And that's one of the glories of being Australian, I reckon. Thank you very much for coming.